In the unforgiving autumn of 1883, the town council of Bitter Creek made a fatal miscalculation. They sought to punish two outcasts by chaining them together. Hazel Caldwell, a reclusive mountain man with hands the size of bear traps, and Abigail Pendleton, a 29-year-old spinster deemed too sharp-tongued and defiant for civil society. The mayor's plan was brutally simple: let the savage brute break the stubborn maiden, and in the aftermath, seize the prime, gold-rich timberland Hazel called home. But the men of Bitter Creek didn't know Abigail. When she finally unleashed what was hidden beneath her prim, high-collared dresses, it didn't just shock her new husband. It terrified the entire county. Bitter Creek, Colorado, was a town built on mud, gold dust, and the ruthless ambitions of men who valued property over human life. At the top of this hierarchy sat Mayor Josiah Pendleton, a man whose piety was matched only by his greed. And living under his oppressive roof was his niece, Abigail. At 29, Abigail was firmly branded an old maid. In a town where girls were wed by 18, her unmarried status was a public scandal. Though it was entirely by her own design, Abigail possessed a mind like a steel trap. She managed her uncle's ledgers, caught his embezzlements, and refused every suitor he threw her way. Men who were nothing more than Josiah's lackeys, seeking to claim her modest inheritance. She dressed in austere grays and blacks, keeping her spine rigid and her mouth shut in public. But behind the closed doors of the Pendleton estate, her defiance was a constant thorn in Josiah's side. "You are a drain on this household, Abigail," Josiah snarled one Tuesday evening, slamming a leather-bound ledger onto the mahogany desk. "And a humiliation to my name. I saved you $400 this quarter by catching the assayer's skim," Abigail replied coolly, not looking up from her embroidery. "You should be thanking me, uncle." Josiah's face mottled with rage. He had a larger problem brewing, one that required a drastic solution. For months, the town council had been trying to get their hands on Widow's Peak, a massive stretch of old-growth timber and untouched mountain streams just north of town. The land belonged to Hazel Caldwell. Hazel was a ghost story whispered by the town drunks. Standing 6'4", with a tangle of dark hair and a permanent scowl, he came down from the mountain only twice a year to trade furs for coffee, salt, and ammunition. Rumors painted him as a savage who had killed 3 men in a Montana Territory dispute and lived amongst the wolves. He spoke to no one, and he certainly wasn't selling his land to Josiah Pendleton. But Josiah had found a loophole. An archaic, half-forgotten territorial law from the town's founding. The Morality and Settlement Act of 1862. It stated that any man occupying an excess of 500 acres within the county bounds must be a married, God-fearing citizen or forfeit the land to the county for redistribution. Furthermore, the town could assign unclaimed, burdensome women to solitary men to promote Christian settlement. The trap was set. It killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Rid Josiah of his defiant, ledger-snooping niece, and place a Pendleton directly on Hazel Caldwell's deed. The confrontation happened in the town square. Sheriff Cobb and 4 armed deputies had ambushed Hazel at the trading post, holding him at gunpoint under bogus charges of trapping on county land. They shackled his massive wrists in heavy iron. A crowd gathered in the dust, watching as the mountain man, eyes burning with a quiet, lethal fury, was dragged to the courthouse steps. Abigail was summoned from the house, flanked by her uncle's men. She wore her darkest gray dress, her face a mask of porcelain calm, though her heart hammered violently against her ribs. "What is the meaning of this, uncle?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "We are securing the moral fortitude of Bitter Creek," Josiah announced loudly, playing to the audience. "Mr. Caldwell here is in violation of the Settlement Act. He is an unmarried savage hoarding county resources. And you, Abigail, have refused your duty as a woman for too long. By the power vested in me as mayor, You are to be wed. Today. Or Caldwell hangs for poaching. And you will be institutionalized for female hysteria." Abigail's eyes darted to the mountain man. Hazel was kneeling in the dirt, the chains rattling as he breathed. Blood trickled from a cut on his brow where a deputy had struck him. He looked up at her. His eyes weren't the mad, feral things the rumors claimed. They were a piercing, intelligent amber, currently clouded with hatred for the town and, by extension, for her. She understood her uncle's play instantly. Josiah expected her to weep, to beg, to be so terrified of the brute that she would run back down the mountain in a week, leaving Josiah the legal right to manage her abandoned estate, Caldwell's land. Abigail looked back at her uncle. She straightened her posture, lifting her chin. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying a chilling clarity. "If it gets me out of your house, Josiah, I will marry the mountain man." A shocked silence fell over the square. Even Hazel flinched, his amber eyes narrowing at her in suspicion. "Unshackle him, Sheriff," Abigail ordered, stepping toward the towering, bloodied man. It's bad luck to marry a man in chains. The wedding was a grotesque parody of a holy sacrament. It took place in the dusty office of the Justice of the Peace, with Sheriff Cobb standing by the door, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt revolver. Hazel stood beside Abigail, reeking of pine needles, leather, and sweat. His sheer size dwarfed her, casting a long shadow over her slender frame. The man hadn't spoken a single word since they ambushed him. When the justice asked for his vow, Hazel merely gave a stiff, jerky nod, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles leaped in his cheeks. Abigail spoke her vows in a steady, unbroken cadence. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. She didn't look at her uncle, who stood in the corner with a smug, self-satisfied grin. As soon as the ink was dry on the marriage certificate, Josiah stepped forward, holding out a second piece of paper. "Now, Abigail, my dear, as your legal guardian until this morning, I've taken the liberty of drafting a management proxy. Just sign this, giving me the rights to oversee the timber operations on your new estate, and you can be on your way." Abigail looked at the paper. She looked at Josiah. Then she calmly reached out, took the paper, and tore it neatly down the middle. She dropped the pieces onto the floorboards. "I am a married woman now, Mayor Pendleton," Abigail said, her voice dripping with ice. "My affairs are my own, or rather, my husband's." She turned to Hazel, who was watching her with a mixture of bafflement and wariness. "Mr. Caldwell," she said formally, "I believe we have a long ride home." The journey up Widow's Peak was grueling. They rode in Hazel's battered wagon, pulled by two massive draft horses. The road was little more than a treacherous, winding rut carved into the side of the mountain. As they ascended, the air grew thin and painfully cold, biting through Abigail's wool shawl. Hazel drove the horses in total silence. He didn't offer her a blanket, nor did he help her when the wagon violently jolted over exposed roots. He was waiting for her to break. He expected tears, complaints, or a hysterical demand to be taken back to town. Abigail offered none. She gripped the wooden seat until her knuckles turned white, staring straight ahead into the darkening timberline. She was terrified not of the mountain, but of the man beside her. She had willingly bound herself to a stranger capable of snapping her neck with one hand. Yet, she preferred the danger of the unknown over the suffocating venom of her uncle's house. They arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The cabin was large, built of thick, hand-hewn logs, nestled against a sheer rock face that protected it from the northern winds. As Hazel finally brought the horses to a halt, he jumped down and walked to her side of the wagon. He didn't offer his hand. He simply watched her. Gathering her heavy skirts, Abigail climbed down on her own, her boots hitting the frozen dirt. Hazel pushed the heavy oak door open. Inside, he grunted. It was the first word she had heard him speak. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, rusted from disuse. Abigail stepped into her new home, bracing
This
herself
story was
for
posted on the
squalor.
channel The Rusty
Instead,
Saddle. Please
she
do not
stopped dead in
repost
her
it in any
tracks.
form.
The cabin was Spartan, but immaculately clean. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall. The wooden floors were swept. Bundles of dried herbs and salted meats hung from the rafters, smelling of sage and hickory. A bookshelf, an actual bookshelf, stood in the corner, lined with worn leather volumes. Hazel moved past her, striking a match to light a kerosene lantern. He then turned to face her, his massive frame blocking the firelight. "I didn't ask for a wife," he said, his tone low and dangerous. "I know who you are. Pendleton's blood. If you think you're going to spy on me, or drive me off my claim so your uncle can bring his logging crews up here, you're dead wrong. You can stay in that bed." He pointed to a sturdy timber bed in the corner, piled high with thick bear and wolf pelts. "I sleep by the fire. If you try to run in the dark, the wolves will have you before you make it halfway down the ridge." Abigail slowly untied the ribbons of her bonnet, her hands trembling slightly, though she hid it well. She met his fierce, amber gaze. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "my uncle forced this upon us to steal your land. I tore up his proxy because I would rather burn in hell than give that man another dime. I don't want your land. I only want a place where Josiah Pendleton cannot reach me." She walked toward the bed, her back straight. "I won't run, and I won't spy, but I will not sleep in your bed while you sleep on the floor. I will take the hearth." Hazel stared at her, genuinely thrown off balance. Before he could argue, Abigail had already gathered a thick wool blanket from the bed, walked to the rug by the cold fireplace, and sat down, curling her knees to her chest. For a long moment, the mountain man just watched the small, stubborn woman sitting on his floor. With a heavy sigh that sounded like a shifting boulder, he grabbed a stack of firewood, built a roaring fire beside her, and then laid his own bedroll on the opposite side of the hearth. They slept in a tense, crackling silence, the lines of their strange war drawn in the ashes. Abigail woke before dawn. The fire had died down to glowing red embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the log walls. She was stiff, her bones aching from the hard floor, but she felt a strange, thrilling sensation in her chest. Freedom. Hazel was already gone. She stood up, smoothing her wrinkled skirts, and began to investigate her new domain. In the daylight filtering through the thick glass windows, she saw the true nature of the mountain man. On a heavy oak table sat a half-finished wood carving of a red-tailed hawk, the detail painfully intricate and delicate. Next to it was a worn copy of Homer's Odyssey, and a notebook filled with elegant, sweeping handwriting, detailing weather patterns, crop yields, and trapping routes. The brute was a scholar. Determined to prove her worth, Abigail found the water pump outside, breaking the thin layer of morning ice. She gathered firewood, found his stash of coffee beans, ground them, and set a heavy iron pot over the resurrected fire. By the time the heavy cabin door swung open, the smell of strong coffee and frying salt pork filled the room. Hazel stepped inside, carrying a brace of rabbits. He froze in the doorway, staring at the table, where 2 tin plates and 2 mugs of steaming coffee were set. He looked at Abigail, who was using a cloth to wipe down the countertops. "Breakfast is ready," she said, not looking at him. Hazel didn't say a word. He walked to the wash basin, scrubbed his massive hands with lye soap, and sat down at the table. He took a bite of the pork, then a sip of the coffee. He paused. It was the best coffee he had tasted in a decade. "You read Greek," Abigail stated, bringing a plate of biscuits to the table and sitting opposite him. Hazel's amber eyes flicked to the bookshelf, then back to her. "I read a lot of things. Passes the winter. You are not the savage my uncle claims you to be, and you are not the weeping violet I expected." Hazel set his mug down. "Why did your uncle really force this, Abigail? If it was just the land, he could have hired a gun to shoot me in the back. He's tried before." Abigail looked down at her plate, Josiah has embezzled thousands of dollars from the town's mining investors. I kept his books. I found the discrepancies 3 weeks ago. I threatened to take them to the federal marshal in Denver if he didn't stop. He couldn't kill me. Too many people know I keep his affairs. It would look suspicious. By marrying me off to the beast of Widow's Peak, he solved 2 problems. If you kill me, he gets your land and buries his secrets. If I run away, he locks me in an asylum for madness. Hazel absorbed this, his jaw working as he chewed his food. The sheer, calculated evil of it disgusted him. He looked at the frail-looking woman sitting across from him. She had faced down a corrupt mayor, a sheriff, and now him, all without shedding a single tear. "You're a Caldwell now," Hazel said gruffly, his voice a low rumble. "Pendleton's reach stops at the bottom of this mountain, but Josiah Pendleton was not a man who waited." Just 3 days later, the fragile, quiet truce between Abigail and Hazel was shattered. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon. Hazel was in the barn, shoeing one of the draft horses, while Abigail was on the porch, beating the dust out of the rugs. The sound of approaching hooves echoed up the trail. Abigail stopped, her blood running cold. Riding into the clearing was Sheriff Cobb, accompanied by 2 armed deputies and a bespectacled man in a suit, Elias Finch, the county surveyor. Hazel stepped out of the barn, a heavy farrier's hammer still in his grip. His face darkened into a thunderous scowl. "Afternoon, Caldwell," Sheriff Cobb called out, reining in his horse but keeping a safe distance. He looked at Abigail on the porch, smirking. "See, the little lady is still alive." Mayor was getting worried. "Get off my land, Cobb," Hazel growled, taking a slow step forward. Now, Cobb said, resting his hand on his revolver. "We're here on official county business. Mayor Pendleton, as the closest blood relative to your new bride, has filed a petition of conservatorship. Claims a man of your uncivilized nature ain't fit to manage the assets of a respectable woman. Mr. Finch here is just gonna draw up the survey line so the mayor's logging crews can start cutting the lower ridge tomorrow morning." Hazel's grip on the hammer tightened until his knuckles cracked. "I own this land." "You own the cabin, boy," Cobb spat. "The timber rights belong to your wife under the new marriage tax code, and her uncle speaks for her. I speak for myself." Abigail's voice rang out, sharp as a cracked whip. Cobb chuckled. "Now, Miss Abigail, you just go on inside. Your uncle sent us to rescue you from this brute." Abigail didn't go inside. Instead, she turned, walked briskly to the woodpile, and picked up Hazel's Winchester repeating rifle that he always left leaning against the logs while he worked. The fluid, practiced motion with which she checked the chamber and racked the lever sent a jolt of shock through the men. She walked to the edge of the porch, raising the heavy rifle to her shoulder. She didn't point it at the sheriff. She pointed it directly at Elias Finch, the surveyor, who was holding a rolled-up map of her husband's land. "Mr. Finch," Abigail said, her voice deadly calm, stripped of all polite society pretense. "Drop that map." Finch swallowed hard, looking at Cobb. She wouldn't. Bang. The deafening crack of the Winchester shattered the mountain silence. A splinter of wood erupted from the saddle horn mere inches from Finch's hand. The surveyor shrieked, dropping the map into the mud as his horse danced in panic. Sheriff Cobb cursed, drawing his revolver, but before he could level it at Abigail, Hazel moved. The mountain man moved with terrifying, predatory speed, crossing the distance and grabbing the barrel of Cobb's revolver, twisting it upward with bone-crushing force, while shoving the heavy iron hammer against the sheriff's throat. "My wife?" Hazel whispered, his face inches from Cobb's, his amber eyes blazing, told the man to drop the map. Abigail levered another round into the chamber, the metallic clack-clack loud in the tense air. She shifted her aim, leveling the barrel squarely at Sheriff Cobb's chest. "Tell my uncle," Abigail said, her eyes dark and merciless, "that the old maid is dead. Tell him Abigail Caldwell owns this mountain. And if one single axe blade strikes a tree on our ridge, I won't shoot the surveyor. I will ride down to Bitter
This story
Creek
was
and
posted on the
shoot the
channel
mayor."
The Rusty
Cobb
Saddle.
stared at the
Please do
woman on
not
the porch.
repost it in any
The
form.
prim, silent spinster was gone. In her place stood a woman holding a smoking rifle, her eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding fire. He looked at Hazel, who was watching his wife with an expression that bordered on absolute awe. "Let go of my gun, Caldwell," Cobb choked out. Hazel shoved the sheriff backward in the saddle, ripping the revolver from the lawman's grip and tossing it into the mud. "Ride," Hazel commanded. The men didn't need to be told twice. Finch spurred his horse, and the deputies followed, Cobb cursing as they scrambled back down the treacherous mountain path, leaving Abigail and Hazel alone in the settling dust. Abigail slowly lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. Hazel walked over to her, his massive frame blocking the wind. He gently took the Winchester from her trembling hands. He looked down at her, a slow, genuine smile breaking through his thick beard for the first time. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell," Hazel murmured, a deep rumble of respect in his chest. "I suppose we are going to war." The echo of the Winchester rifle changed everything on Widow's Peak. The fragile, frosty barrier between the mountain man and the spinster melted away, replaced by the grim reality of a shared siege. Hazel Caldwell no longer looked at Abigail as a burden forced upon him by a corrupt town council. He looked at her as a comrade in arms. That evening, as a bitter wind howled down through the jagged granite teeth of the Rockies, Hazel barricaded the heavy oak door with a thick iron bar. He stoked the fire until it roared, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. He then pulled a heavy wooden chest from beneath his bed, unlocking it to reveal a small arsenal, a double-barreled shotgun, boxes of brass cartridges, and a pair of perfectly maintained Colt revolvers. Abigail sat at the table, watching him methodically oil the chambers of a revolver. The adrenaline of the afternoon had faded, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. "Josiah won't use the law anymore," Abigail stated, her voice quiet but firm over the crackle of the hearth. "By shooting at his surveyor, I gave him the excuse he needs to tell the town we've gone feral. He'll hire men who don't wear badges." Hazel didn't look up from his work, his massive hands moving with surprising delicacy over the gunmetal. "I've dealt with claim jumpers before. The mountain usually takes care of them before they reach the tree line. But your uncle has money. He'll buy the best guns out of Denver. He doesn't just want the land, Hazel," Abigail said, using his Christian name for the first time. The sound of it hanging in the air made Hazel pause. He finally looked at her, his amber eyes reflecting the firelight. Abigail stood up and walked over to her modest leather trunk, the only possession she had brought from the Pendleton estate. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the brass rivets. "I told you I found the discrepancies in his books. What I didn't tell you is that I didn't just find them. I took them." Hazel watched in stunned silence as Abigail pulled a small, sharp, bone-handled knife from Hazel's own workbench. She turned the trunk on its side and began slicing through the thick, false leather lining of the bottom panel. From the hidden compartment, she withdrew a heavy, red leather-bound ledger. She carried it to the table and dropped it with a heavy thud. "Josiah has been skimming off the town's investments in the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad expansion," Abigail explained, her finger tapping the cover. "Nearly $40,000 over 3 years. He's been hiding the stolen funds in dummy accounts under the names of dead miners. If this ledger makes it to Judge Harlan in the district court, Josiah will hang for federal fraud." Hazel approached the table, wiping the gun oil from his hands with a rag. He stared at the red book as if it were a venomous snake. "You brought this here? Into my house?" "I brought it because it is my only insurance," Abigail said, her chin jutting out defiantly. "When he forced this marriage, he thought the ledger was still locked in his safe. I swapped it for a blank one the night before. By now, he knows it's gone. He knows I have it. He didn't send Sheriff Cobb today just to survey the land. He sent him to see if I had hidden it here, A low, rumbling chuckle escaped Hazel's chest, echoing off the log walls. He looked at the frail, prim woman in her dark gray dress, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You robbed the mayor of Bitter Creek blind, hid the evidence under your petticoats, and brought a federal death warrant to my mountain." "I did," she said, her breath catching slightly as he stepped closer. His towering presence was overwhelming, but she refused to step back. "Abigail Caldwell," Hazel murmured, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You are the most dangerous creature I have ever met." For the next week, the mountain became a fortress. Hazel taught Abigail how to shoot the Winchester, not just to scare, but to kill. He showed her how to account for the wind coming off the ridge, how to lead a moving target, and how to reload in the dark until her fingers bled and calloused. In return, Abigail organized his provisions, mapping out exactly how long they could survive a winter siege if Josiah cut off the supply trail from town. The tension between them shifted from suspicion to a deep, unspoken magnetism. One evening, while Abigail was binding a cut on Hazel's forearm, an injury from slipping on an icy crag while setting tripwires, she felt the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse beneath her fingertips. He watched her face, his gaze intense and searching, stripping away the spinster facade she had worn her whole life. He saw her, truly saw her, and in the quiet isolation of Widow's Peak, Abigail realized she was no longer afraid of the mountain man. She was afraid of losing him, but the quiet could not last. Down in Bitter Creek, Josiah Pendleton had discovered the blank ledger in his safe, and his desperation had curdled into murderous rage. The first snow of the season fell on a moonless Tuesday night, blanketing Widow's Peak in a suffocating, blinding white. The temperature plummeted, freezing the streams solid and silencing the nocturnal wildlife. Inside the cabin, Hazel jolted awake. He was sleeping on his bedroll near the fire, but his eyes snapped open in the pitch dark. Years of surviving the wilderness had given him instincts sharper than a wolf's. Something was wrong. The silence outside was too heavy. The subtle, ambient rustling of the wind through the pines had been disturbed. He rolled silently to his feet, grabbing the shotgun leaning against the stone hearth. He moved to the bed where Abigail was sleeping, pressing a large, calloused hand over her mouth. Abigail woke with a start, her eyes wide with panic in the dim embers' glow, but she didn't scream. Hazel slowly removed his hand and leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "Riders," he breathed. "Halfway up the ridge. The horses are muffled, but they tripped the wire on the lower switchback." Abigail threw off the heavy pelts, instantly wide awake. She didn't ask questions. She moved to the table, grabbed the Winchester, and began stuffing spare cartridges into the deep pockets of her wool skirt. Hazel cracked the heavy wooden shutter of the front window just an inch. Peering through the swirling snow, he saw them. 5 faint, dark silhouettes dismounting at the edge of the tree line. They carried no lanterns. They were moving with the synchronized, lethal stealth of professional killers. "Pinkertons? Or hired guns?" Abigail whispered, stepping up beside him. "Worse," Hazel growled, his jaw clenching. "Rustlers out of the Wyoming Territory. Josiah hired scavengers. They won't just kill us. They'll burn the cabin to the ground with us in it to destroy that ledger. What do we do?" Hazel looked at her, his amber eyes hard as flint. "You hold the cabin. Bar the door. Shoot anything that comes through that window. I am going out." "No." Abigail grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the thick wool of his union suit. "Hazel, there are 5 of them. You can't fight them in the snow." Hazel brought his hand up, cupping her cheek. His touch was rough, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. "This is my mountain, Abigail. They are fighting in my element now." Before she could protest further, Hazel slipped out the reinforced back door of the cabin, melting into the blinding blizzard like a phantom. Abigail quickly dropped the heavy iron bar across the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood in the center of the dark cabin, the Winchester raised, listening to the howling wind. Minutes ticked by like agonizing hours. The snow outside muffled all sound, creating a terrifying
This story
vacuum
was
of
posted on
sensory
the channel The
deprivation.
Rusty Saddle.
Then,
Please do not
the
repost
first
it in any
scream
form.
tore through the night. It was a sound of pure, sudden terror, abruptly cut short by a sickening crunch. Abigail flinched, gripping the rifle tighter. Hazel had found the first one. Outside, the snowstorm was a weapon in Hazel Caldwell's hands. He moved barefoot through the drifts, his massive body immune to the biting cold, stepping only on the exposed roots and rocks he knew by heart. The hired killers were blinded, stumbling blindly toward the cabin with kerosene torches unlit to maintain the element of surprise. Hazel dropped from a low-hanging pine branch directly onto the second man, his sheer weight driving the killer face first into the frozen mud. Before the man could cry out, Hazel's hunting knife found the gap between his heavy coat collar and his neck. But the third man saw the shadow fall. He raised his revolver and fired blindly into the dark. The gunshot shattered the silence of the mountain. Inside the cabin, Abigail rushed to the window, peering through the crack. She saw the muzzle flash illuminate the falling snow. Suddenly, the front door of the cabin shuddered violently. Someone was slamming a heavy wooden post against the reinforced oak. Bang! The hinges groaned. Bang! "Open up, little lady," a rough voice shouted over the wind. "Pendleton wants his book. Hand it over. And we make it quick." Abigail backed away from the window, leveling the Winchester squarely at the center of the door. The wood splintered with a third, massive blow, and the iron bar began to bend. She didn't panic. She remembered Hazel's voice. Breathe. Squeeze. Don't pull. As the door violently gave way, bursting open in a shower of splinters and driving snow, a massive man in a buffalo coat lunged into the cabin, a double-barreled shotgun raised. Abigail didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The Winchester roared, illuminating the cabin in a flash of yellow fire. The heavy, .44 caliber slug caught the man square in the shoulder, spinning him violently backward into the snowbank with a howl of agony. His shotgun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling timbers. Abigail quickly levered another round, the hot brass casing clinking onto the floorboards. She advanced to the ruined doorway, aiming out into the blinding snow. Suddenly, a figure materialized from the whiteout. Abigail almost fired, but stopped just in time. It was Hazel. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his own. He looked at the groaning man Abigail had shot, then looked up at her, standing in the doorway, the rifle steady in her hands. "The other two?" Abigail asked, her voice trembling only slightly. "Running," Hazel rasped, stepping over the wounded man and into the cabin. "They won't make it to the bottom. The snow is too deep, and they lost their horses." Hazel knelt beside the man groaning in the snow. He grabbed him by the collar of his buffalo coat and hauled him effortlessly into the cabin, tossing him onto the floor. The man clutched his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with terror as the giant mountain man towered over him. "You're going to tell me exactly what Josiah Pendleton is planning," Hazel rumbled, drawing his hunting knife. "Or I drag you back outside and let the wolves finish what my wife started." The killer swallowed hard, looking at Abigail, who was still pointing the smoking rifle at his head. He realized with absolute horror that the legends were wrong. The mountain man wasn't the most dangerous thing on Widow's Peak. It was the old maid who had shot him without blinking an eye. He's bringing the county militia," the wounded man stammered, coughing up blood. "He declared you both outlaws. Bounties. $5,000 for Caldwell, $2,000 for the woman. He told the town you murdered the surveyor. Tomorrow morning, 50 armed men are marching up this mountain to burn you out." Abigail lowered the rifle, exchanging a grim, terrifying look with her husband. Josiah wasn't just trying to cover his tracks anymore. He had waged a full-scale war on Widow's Peak. Dawn broke over the Rockies, not with warmth, but with a blinding, crystalline glare. The blizzard had passed. leaving behind 3 feet of fresh powder that buried the jagged rocks and treacherous ravines of Widow's Peak. The world was utterly silent, a white canvas waiting for the blood that was sure to follow. Inside the shattered cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. Hazel had dragged a heavy oak armoire across the ruined doorway, reinforcing it with whatever timber they could spare. He had spent the remaining hours of darkness stripping the rusted iron from his traps, packing the jagged shrapnel into a dozen crude black powder charges using mining dynamite he kept in the cellar. Abigail watched him work, her gray wool dress stained with the rustler's blood from the night before. She sat by the hearth, the Winchester resting across her lap. She was no longer the trembling spinster of Bitter Creek. The mountain had burned the frailty out of her, forging something cold and unyielding in its place. "They won't bring wagons in this snow," Hazel murmured, tying off a fuse with numb fingers. "They'll have to come on horseback, single file up the Devil's Spine. It's a sheer drop on the left, an ice wall on the right, and 50 men against 2, Abigail replied, her voice steady. "Josiah won't lead the charge. He's a coward. He'll send Sheriff Cobb and the mercenaries first. The townsfolk he riled up into a militia will bring up the rear." Hazel looked up, his amber eyes locking onto hers. "I don't want to massacre 50 men, Abigail. Most of them are just fools who believe your uncle's lies about me being a murderous savage." "Then we don't shoot to kill the militia," Abigail said, her mind working with the same ruthless efficiency she had used on her uncle's ledgers. "We break their morale. We show them the mountain is awake." By mid-morning, the warning came. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration. The distant, rhythmic crunch of hooves punching through deep crust. Hazel moved to the high loft, kicking out a small ventilation slat to create a sniper's nest. He handed Abigail a pair of brass spyglasses. Through the lens, Abigail saw them. A long, dark serpent, winding its way up the narrow, treacherous pass known as the Devil's Spine. Sheriff Cobb rode at the front, his face wrapped in a wool scarf, a lever-action rifle resting on his saddle. Behind him rode a dozen hard-eyed men with the unmistakable slouch of hired guns. And far in the back, safely buffered by a wall of bodies, was Mayor Josiah Pendleton, bundled in a luxurious fur coat. "They're at the switchback," Abigail called out softly. "Get away from the window," Hazel ordered. He struck a match, the sulfur hissing loudly in the quiet cabin, and touched the flame to a long, braided fuse that ran out a drilled hole in the log wall. The fuse sparked and hissed, racing out into the snow. A mile down the trail, Sheriff Cobb halted his horse. The beast was tossing its head, nervously pawing at the deep snow. "Keep moving," Josiah bellowed from the rear, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I want that beast swinging from a pine tree before noon." Cobb opened his mouth to reply, but the words never came. A thunderous roar fractured the silence. It wasn't the crack of a rifle. It was the deep, concussive boom of dynamite, detonating deep within the ice pack high above the pass. The ground shuddered violently. The mercenaries looked up in horror. High on the ridge, a massive cornice of overhanging snow and ancient ice gave way. It cascaded downward, gathering speed and mass until it became a roaring, blinding tidal wave of white death. "Avalanche!" Cobb screamed, fighting his terrified horse. The snowslide didn't hit the men. Hazel was a master of his terrain. He had calculated the blast to shear the ice wall just 50 yards behind the mercenary vanguard, right where the narrow trail met the wider plateau. The avalanche roared across the path, severing the route completely. When the white cloud finally settled, the reality of the situation dawned on the invaders. The 50-man militia from Bitter Creek, along with Josiah Pendleton, were trapped on the safe, lower side of the massive snow blockage. But Sheriff Cobb and 12 hired killers were sealed on the upper ridge. Their retreat was cut off. The only way forward was up straight into the waiting guns of the mountain man and his wife. The deep, concussive boom of the dynamite fractured the icy silence of the mountain, echoing down the canyon walls like the gavel of a wrathful god. Inside the cabin's loft,
This story was
the
posted on the
shockwave
channel The
rattled the
Rusty
heavy
Saddle.
timber joints
Please do not
and sent
repost
a
it in
shower
any
of
form.
dust drifting down from the rafters. Hazel and Abigail Caldwell stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim light, the sharp, sulphurous tang of exploded rock and vaporized snow drifting through the narrow ventilation slat. Down on the jagged bottleneck known as the Devil's Spine, absolute chaos had consumed the vanguard of Josiah Pendleton's hired guns. The meticulously calculated avalanche had sheared the ice wall precisely where Hazel intended, sending a blinding, roaring wave of white death across the trail. It severed the path entirely. Mayor Josiah Pendleton and the 50 exhausted, frostbitten militiamen from Bitter Creek were safely walled off on the lower, wider plateau. But Sheriff Cobb and his dozen hardened mercenaries were trapped on the upper ridge. They were penned in a frozen corridor barely 20 feet wide, bordered by a sheer drop into the abyss on their left and an impassable, vertical rock face on their right. Their only route of escape was blocked by 50 tons of packed snow. Their only path forward led directly into the crosshairs of the mountain man. Hazel did not hesitate. The air was still thick with settling snow dust when he leveled the massive barrel of his Sharps buffalo rifle through the firing slot. "They're panicking," Hazel rumbled, his voice a low, vibrating hum in the tense quiet of the loft. His thumb pulled back the heavy external hammer with a sharp, metallic click that sounded deafening to Abigail. "Cobb has lost them. They know they can't turn back, and they know the high ground belongs to us." Through her brass spyglasses, Abigail watched the scene unfold. The mercenaries were whipping their terrified horses, the beasts rearing and bucking as they struggled to find footing in the deep, fresh powder. Several men drew their revolvers, firing blindly and wildly up the slope toward the cabin. The heavy lead slugs thumped harmlessly into the thick, hand-hewn oak logs of the Caldwell fortress or kicked up useless geysers of white snow 50 yards short. "Hold your fire, Abigail," Hazel commanded, adjusting his sights. He wasn't aiming at a man. He was aiming at a massive, deadwood pine that leaned precariously over the upper edge of the trail, its roots long rotted by years of harsh winters. "Let them waste their powder. We break their spirit before we break their bodies." Hazel exhaled a slow, steady breath. Crack. The Sharps rifle spoke with the wrath of a thunderbolt. The recoil pushed Hazel's massive shoulder back, but his hands remained perfectly steady. The heavy, 50 caliber slug sailed through the freezing air and struck the rotted base of the deadwood pine with devastating kinetic force. The ancient trunk groaned, the sound carrying over the gunfire like a dying beast before it violently snapped. The massive tree crashed directly across the narrow trail, violently throwing 2 mercenaries from their saddles and sending them tumbling into the deep, suffocating drifts. The barrier was complete. The hired killers were entirely boxed in. The fight drained out of the mercenaries in an instant. The freezing cold, the sheer impossibility of an uphill assault in 3 feet of snow, and the terrifying, unseen precision of the mountain man completely sapped their courage. They were killers motivated by Josiah's gold, not loyal soldiers willing to die for it. One by one, the men dropped from their saddles, sinking to their waists in the snow, and threw their Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers into the drifts. They raised their hands high, their breaths pluming in the freezing air, surrendering to the mountain. But Sheriff Cobb was a man with entirely too much to lose. He knew the truth about the red leather ledger. He knew that if Josiah Pendleton went to the gallows for federal embezzlement, the mayor would drag his corrupt sheriff down to hell right beside him. Surrender was a death sentence. Desperate, Cobb abandoned his panicked horse. He threw himself into the deep snow beside the rock face, disappearing into a deep trench of powder. He began crawling frantically, hand over hand, toward the blind eastern side of the cabin. Clenched tightly in his teeth was a single stick of mining dynamite, a long fuse already prepped. If he could just reach the rear wall, He could blow the cabin to splinters, destroying the ledger and the Caldwells in one fiery stroke. Inside the cabin, Abigail felt a subtle, rhythmic vibration through the heavy floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It was the desperate, dragging weight of a man moving through the snowdrift banked against the foundation. She didn't wait for Hazel, who was keeping his rifle trained on the surrendered mercenaries. She moved with a cold, terrifying serenity. She shoved the heavy iron ring of the cellar trapdoor, dropping quietly into the frigid, pitch-black darkness of the root cellar. She crawled through the narrow, dirt-packed escape tunnel Hazel had dug years ago, a tunnel that led out behind the massive cordwood pile at the rear of the cabin. Abigail emerged into the biting wind, her dark wool dress blending into the shadows of the stacked timber. She stepped out just as Sheriff Cobb struck a sulfur match against a frozen rock, his freezing, trembling fingers preparing to touch the flame to the dynamite's fuse. "Drop it, Cobb." Abigail's voice sliced through the whistling wind. It was sharper than the mountain ice, completely stripped of the polite, submissive cadence the town of Bitter Creek had forced upon her for 29 years. Cobb froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head slowly to see the old maid standing waist-deep in the snowdrift, her lever-action Winchester rifle leveled squarely at the center of his chest. Her gray eyes were devoid of mercy, hard and unyielding as polished granite. "You're a dead woman, Abigail," Cobb spat, his hand hovering agonizingly close to the fuse, trying to calculate if he was faster than her trigger finger. "Your uncle has 50 men digging through that avalanche right now. When they breach that wall, they'll burn this cabin to the ground and dance on your ashes. Let them dig," Abigail said smoothly, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "But you won't live to see the fire." Before Cobb could make a foolish gamble and spark the fuse, the unmistakable, heavy, metallic click of a revolver hammer being cocked echoed from the tree line to his immediate left. Cobb turned to see Hazel Caldwell standing like an avenging titan in the snow. The mountain man had moved with absolute, predatory silence. Hazel held a heavy Colt revolver aimed directly at the lawman's head, his amber eyes blazing with a lethal promise. "The lady told you to drop it," Hazel snarled, his voice vibrating with violence. Cobb looked at the massive mountain man, then back to the fiercely resolute woman holding the rifle. He opened his mouth, the stick of dynamite tumbling into the snow. The match fizzled out against the wet ice. It took another 3 agonizing hours for the sounds of shovels and pickaxes to announce the breakthrough of the militia. The townsfolk of Bitter Creek, physically exhausted, freezing, and whipped into a murderous frenzy by Mayor Pendleton, finally scrambled over the crest of the avalanche debris. They gripped their hunting rifles tightly, fully expecting to find the bloody, ravaged remains of the mayor's niece and the savage mountain man who had allegedly taken her captive. Instead, the 50 men crested the ridge and stopped dead in their tracks, their jaws going slack. Standing on the elevated wooden porch of the cabin were Hazel and Abigail Caldwell, utterly unharmed. Sitting in the snow below them, entirely disarmed and bound together with heavy, thick trapping rope, were Sheriff Cobb and the 12 surviving mercenaries from Wyoming. Mayor Josiah Pendleton pushed his way violently to the front of the stunned, silent militia. His face was mottled purple with sheer rage and physical exhaustion, his expensive fur coat dusted with snow. "Shoot him," Josiah screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Hazel. "He's an outlaw, a murderer. He kidnapped my niece and slaughtered the sheriff's men. I order you to fire. Damn you." Not a single townsman raised their rifle. The men of Bitter Creek looked from their frantic, screaming mayor to the calm, imposing figures standing on the porch, and then to the terrified mercenaries tied up in the snow. The narrative Josiah had spun simply did not match the reality before their eyes. Abigail stepped forward to the edge of the porch, raising a hand. In it, she held the heavy, red leather-bound ledger. "Townsmen of Bitter Creek," Abigail shouted, her voice carrying over the wind, echoing off the canyon walls with undeniable, piercing authority. "My uncle brought you up this mountain, under the false guise of the law. He told you, my husband is a savage beast. He told you I was a helpless captive. He lied to you all." Josiah lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly desperation. But two prominent townsmen, the local blacksmith and the apothecary, hesitantly reached out and grabbed the mayor's arms, holding him back. "This ledger," Abigail continued, holding the book high so the red leather caught the harsh winter sunlight, "contains the undeniable, handwritten proof that Mayor Josiah Pendleton has stolen nearly $40,000 from this town's mining and railroad investments over the last 3 years. He arranged this forced marriage to steal my husband's prime timberland and bury his financial secrets. He paid these Wyoming rustlers to murder us in our beds.
The story was
so the
posted
truth
on the
would burn
channel
with
The
us.
Rusty Saddle.
Lies.
Please do
They
not
are
repost it
hysterical.
in any form.
Female lies. Josiah shrieked, thrashing wildly against the men holding his arms. "She's entirely mad. The beast has driven her out of her mind. Shoot them both." "They aren't lies, Mayor." A booming, unfamiliar voice called out from the very back of the militia crowd. The townsfolk parted like the Red Sea. Riding slowly up the freshly cleared trail, on massive, heavily muscled bay horses, were 6 men wearing thick canvas dusters. Pinned to their chests were the gleaming, unmistakable silver stars of United States Marshals. At their head was Marshal Gideon Croft, a grizzled, hardened veteran with a face like tanned saddle leather and a mustache dusted with frost. Josiah's blood instantly ran cold, his frantic struggles ceasing as true. Paralyzing terror took hold. Marshal Croft nudged his horse forward, stopping at the base of the porch. He looked up and tipped his wide-brimmed hat respectfully to Abigail. "Mrs. Caldwell, we received your telegraph in Denver 4 days ago. It took us a while to cut through this damn storm, but your detailed accounting of your uncle's dummy accounts checked out down to the very last penny at the Federal Bank." A collective, shocked gasp rippled through the Bitter Creek militia. The townsfolk slowly turned their furious, betrayed gazes upon Josiah Pendleton, the pious, wealthy man who had robbed them blind and nearly tricked them into committing cold-blooded murder on a snowy ridge. Abigail had never just stolen the ledger in a panic. She had meticulously orchestrated her uncle's downfall long before she was ever dragged to the altar in chains. She had paid a passing stagecoach driver to carry her detailed telegraph to the marshals in Denver the very day before the forced wedding. The brutal mountain siege was merely her calculated way of surviving until the federal law arrived to clean up Bitter Creek. Josiah's knees buckled. He fell to the snow, weeping openly as Marshal Croft dismounted and slapped heavy, rusted iron cuffs onto his wrists. Sheriff Cobb was hauled up by his coat collar by 2 other marshals, his face pale, destined for the exact same federal transport wagon. As the marshals began the arduous task of marching the corrupt officials and the bound mercenaries back down the mountain pass, the townsfolk of Bitter Creek lingered for a moment. They looked up at Hazel Caldwell, the terrifying mythical beast of Widow's Peak, and then at Abigail, the quiet spinster they had openly mocked and dismissed for years. They realized in that cold, silent moment that the arrogant town council hadn't fed a defenseless lamb to a wolf. They had unwittingly unleashed a lioness, and she had just claimed the highest, most powerful peak in the entire county. Hazel stepped up beside his wife, wrapping a massive, warm arm around her shoulders. He pulled her close against his side, shielding her from the biting northern wind. Abigail leaned into his incredible strength, finally lowering the heavy Winchester rifle. Her heart, which had been racing for days, finally settled into a steady, peaceful rhythm. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell," Hazel whispered, his amber eyes shining with a profound, unshakable reverence as he looked down at her. "It seems the siege is broken. We finally have the mountain to ourselves." Abigail looked up at the mountain man, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face for the first time in years. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she murmured. We certainly do. In the years that followed the bitter winter of 1883, the legend of Widow's Peak was rewritten. Mayor Josiah Pendleton and Sheriff Cobb died in federal prison. Their stolen wealth returned to the bruised town of Bitter Creek. The citizens learned to fear, respect, and eventually revere the Caldwells. Abigail Caldwell transformed the once isolated cabin into a thriving, untouchable estate, managing the county's most lucrative and ethical timber operation without ever sacrificing a single old-growth pine. Hazel remained the silent guardian of the mountain, a man whose brutal reputation shielded his gentle heart and his fiercely brilliant wife. The town council had intended to break a defiant spinster and steal from a savage brute, but their cruelty merely forged an unbreakable dynasty. What Abigail did terrified the county, but it was the profound, unshakable love between the mountain man and the old maid that ultimately conquered it.